I'm here with Joseph Patel, a producer for Sly Lives, aka the Burden of Black Genius.
Do you believe in the concept of black genius?
Black genius?
Wow. When did you first find Sly?
That's a good question. I mean, probably not consciously understood, like, or had heard Sly songs when I was a kid, because I used to listen to the radio obsessively. Didn't really understand that I was listening to Sly probably until I was in high school. And it was mainly through hip hop, right? I was listening to hip hop and I was like, what's that sample? And then you trace something back. I think it was a De La Soul song. And I bought Greatest Hits, and you know, that album is a banger with every single song on there is a banger. And then, but really actually it's interesting because like, for me, I was more obsessed with Parliament and Funkadelic than Sly.
They were my first concert when I was in 9th grade.
Yeah, oh wow.
And yeah.
I grew up in the Bay, so I don't think I saw Parliament and Funkadelic until I was in college, maybe, in Berkeley. And so, you know, truth be told, when we started this project, I was not a Sly obsessive. I liked Sly fine, I liked the songs, I knew the samples, but I didn't know the story, I didn't know the sort of chronology of the albums and sort of the different formations of the band. I was more obsessed with Parliament and Funkadelic. And when we started the film, like, there's a good 6-month period where I sort of had to ramp up to like even just get close to where Amir was, because I think Sly made a deep impact on him when he was younger. And we're the same age, so it's a little interesting how we came to it. But like, you know, his parents played him Sly music, so Sly had a profound impact on Amir. And when we started the film, he was so fluent in the story, I had to spend about 6 months just to catch up. And just to even understand, like, I listened to all the records in chronological order, did some digging about like the early singles, read the oral history, watched some of the other docs that had been made that were up on YouTube and like fan docs, and like just try to get a grasp on the story before we could even talk about like what the approach was that we were going to take for the film.
So when did Amir decide, or when did you guys decide that this was the next doc after Summer of Soul?
Actually, it's funny, I didn't know this until recently, doing press for this movie. Amir says he got a call from Common while we were editing Summer of Soul, and Common and his production company had acquired the life rights to Sly Stone with a company out of Vancouver called Network Productions. And so they approached him, and we premiered Summer of Soul at Sundance. It was virtual that year in 2021, and by the end of the weekend, I think we premiered on a Thursday, by Monday, there was an announcement that Amir had signed up to do the Sly Stone documentary. Common hadn't even seen Summer of Soul yet when he approached Amir, but he knew he was directing docs. And so I called Amir and I'm like, is this what we're doing next? He's like, yeah. And I'm like, cool. We didn't start till like a year later, a little over a year later. We had our first meeting about what kind of doc we wanted to make probably a month after the Oscars.
Because of Sly being a big character in that like, for me it seemed like the dovetail would be almost immediate.
Yeah, and I think Amir said yes to it because he was pondering this idea that Sly is on stage at the Harlem Cultural Festival in July of '69, and 10 days later he's headlining Woodstock, and his life changes forever. And so I think that idea stayed with Amir for a while. Our first conversation was, we decided on two things that I think actually reflect in the final film. One is, tells Sly's story with a lot of empathy. It's sort of a classic music story, right? Classic rock story, like rise and fall. But with Sly, it was a little different because he's a black artist in America. He's the first post-civil rights crossover of success as a black artist. He's got an equal-sized white audience as black audience. There's a little different framing to his story. And then, you know, obviously the drug addiction for many decades, and we just wanted to tell his story with some empathy. And then two was this idea that for Amir, as an artist, he had been struggling with some, you know, feelings of guilt from all the success that he's had recently. And our collaborative storytelling focus is, how do we tell a specific story about something bigger? And so the Sly story is the specific story, but this bigger idea is that Sly was like one of the first black artists to really struggle with the idea of success. And that was something that had reverberated through down to like Amir and his contemporaries. So that bigger idea and that idea of empathy is something we agreed on in the first meeting.
There's a riot going on album cover. That red, black, and white flag inspired the Stankonia album cover. To wrap that flag around you is interesting when you see a black person do it, because you know our version of America is different from the rest of the world's view of America. We're in an America, but then we're in a black America too. We're in two different realities.
I think what makes this film unique is that it's told from the perspective of another black artist, right? A lot of the other sort of fan docs that are done on Sly and a lot of the books that have been written about him are all from sort of white rock critic perspectives. And so this was a little different perspective. And I think Amir, you know, he's struggled with this too. Like even after the Oscars, he has these, you know, sort of arresting feelings of guilt. Will my band members accept me the same as they would before? And he said that he sees a lot of that struggle of guilt and anxiety and shame that comes with success with his peer group. Other artists that he's worked with. And he says that's something, when he traced it back, he sort of pointed to Sly as being the first to sort of navigate the space like that.
You have people like Andre 3000 and D'Angelo talking like so eloquently about it. But like in D'Angelo, who I feel like had his own rise and then he disappeared for a while.
Yeah, I mean, in a weird way, those artists, D'Angelo, Q-Tip, Dream Hampton, Chaka Khan, are sort of proxies for Sly. If you don't know who those artists are or their backstories, it's still interesting what they say. But if you do know their backstories, if you do know that D'Angelo on the Voodoo tour had crippling anxiety to make it out on stage every night, and the drummer in his band for that tour is Amir. It's Questlove, right? He got a bird's eye view of what D'Angelo is going through, to go out every night on stage and have to perform How Does It Feel with his shirt off to screaming throngs of women every night. The shows would get later and later and later because D'Angelo just couldn't make it on stage. And he, even in our interview, talked about his drug addiction and those feelings of shame and guilt that he went through. So when he says it on camera in this context, he's talking about Sly, but he's also talking about himself.
Is that part of the reason also why you never see Questlove on camera in this? That this is sort of something that you wanted to give voice to the other artists?
Yeah, it's a good question. We actually debated whether we should put Amir in the chair as well. He was reluctant to do that because he's in every doc, and this is him actually directing this doc. So I think the compromise, and I think it actually works, is you hear his voice. You don't see him, but you hear his voice. We had a lot of tough questions for the artists, and they answer them. Like nobody really shied away from the answers once we got them in front of the camera. And I think part of that is because they know the questions are coming from another black artist, right? Like this question that sort of bookends the film, is there a burden on black genius? The movie starts with him asking, what is black genius? And we kind of cutesily edited it together where they're like searching for the answer, and ostensibly the film is supposed to be their answer to that question. But the film ends with this question, is there a burden on black genius? After you've seen Sly's story, is there a burden? And they answer, and none of them were shy about answering because they had all been through it, and they know that question was being asked from someone else who had been through it. So if I had asked the question, if you had asked the question, I don't know if we would have gotten the same answers.
Oh, totally. Is that not something that you also dealt with at some point in your career? I mean, you've been successful, filmmaker, journalist. I mean, is that something that before this film was something that you had considered?
No. I feel like I'm living a dream for the last 7 years. So I had imposter syndrome probably at a point in my career when I was already successful. At least, anybody else would say, oh, you've had a successful career, but still suffered from imposter syndrome. But like the last few years, I feel just blessed. So, but that being said, I think the film itself is about a black artist in America, post-civil rights era, and extends through today, right? And one of the things that we did with the key art, if you look at the poster of the film, the word black is crossed out. And we didn't want to be too heavy-handed about it, but the idea is that this feeling that you leave the movie with is, to have some empathy and grace for our black music heroes, but that the anxiety and struggles with success that they go through actually in different ways other artists go through, whether you're whether you're black, whether you're an artist, whatever. One of Amir's, he has a close friendship with Fiona Apple, and Fiona Apple has told Amir that she's gone through similar things being a woman in this industry, and we've all seen that publicly, how she was treated and how she was sort of like, praised and then disposed of from an industry standpoint. She's been public about her struggles with that too. So the idea was, even though this film is about Sly and about black artists in general, that you could actually extrapolate it to different groups of artists.
Totally. I mean, you have D'Angelo talking about it. Black artists don't have the same grace as white ones. That Bowie had all the space to be able to explore all elements of his personality and psyche, and that black artists don't get the same. And in Underdog, Sly's you got to be twice as good.
Yeah.
It's an important message to be told, because I don't think fans or people in this country especially are even aware.
Yeah, that David Bowie line that Q-Tip actually says is really powerful. Because if you're a Bowie fan, you understand, part of the reason we hail him is because of the changes. And Sly was just not given that space or grace. And those reviews of Riot from, some of the stalwarts of rock criticism are pretty, coded language and pretty savage in terms of just Sly wanting to do what he wanted to do. They wanted more of the same, and Sly obviously wasn't in that same space.
And just seeing all these people feel like they can throw certain words around and and not
pimp's wisdom and gangster looks, and you're just like, what's wrong with you, man?
Seriously.
Yeah. And someone like D'Angelo, he's sort of the modern day Sly. He's been through very similar things. Someone like Andre is different, where Andre's fans, Outkast fans, want him to rap, and he doesn't want to rap. And so he looked out into the landscape and was like, if I continue rapping and I don't want to, it's going to be really messy for me, and I'm not going to feel it in my heart. So he went the other way. He started playing the flute. So having him on camera is interesting because, he's not a cautionary tale. He's actually someone who probably has authored a new template of which to follow. That if you don't feel it in your heart to do the thing that people want you to do, don't do it.
And he talks about how you spend all this time taking in all of this energy and then and then giving out all this energy, and then when you just stop, what do you fill it with? And
I love that line so much.
It's so good, and it's so true. It's like so many artists just fill that with what gives them the feeling, but without all the other stuff.
It just cuts to the point, and you pair that line with what Chaka was talking about elsewhere in the film, where Chaka is talking about, Amir straight up asked her, why does an artist use drugs? And she's like, to make you feel like everything's okay when it's not. And those two lines, I think, are pretty powerful together.
It nails that empathy line, where I think a lot of people who, spent years following Sly's career and going to shows that he never showed up to, or started playing 3 hours late. I went to his show at BB King's. I think it was his first show back in New York.
Oh, right, yeah.
Where they had two shows. They had one I think at 8 and one at 10:30. The one at 8, they kept pushing him on stage and he kept leaving because he wasn't right yet. And then my brother, who I was there with, bought a ticket for the next show, because he was like, I think he'll be better in the next show. Yeah. And he was, and he'd gotten level, and he put on a great show. But it was I got to experience what so many people had experienced before that, which was the Sly experience.
Yeah.
In that way. So I guess it's so many people who sort of saw Sly's rise and fall wouldn't have that empathy, because they saw it just from the place of a fan who wanted the experience.
Yeah, and I'll give you a little jewel in this interview, is we actually interviewed Sly for Summer of Soul, and it just wasn't. We didn't feel like it was respectful to put it in the film. His health is just a concern. He still has this sort of mischievous, lucid light behind his eyes, and from all accounts, we were in touch with his family and in touch with Arlene, his manager, former girlfriend, current manager, who's really worked tirelessly for the last 10 years, 12 years to get his business affairs in order. And, he lives in the Valley, and his kids and his grandkids come and visit him every weekend. Freddie and Rose make it down there sometimes. Jerry and Greg, check in with him a lot. And we just were like, he just doesn't have the motor function to do an interview. And we didn't think it would be appropriate to put him out on camera just because we had access to
That's what I figured.
You know, the film ends with a beautiful photo of him that was taken like 6 months ago, and that is the first portrait he's done in a long time. And we thought that was a good acknowledgement of, you know, how we revere him and just show him in a good light and that he's still alive. You know, the title of the film sort of plays into that idea. It's like, you know, with anybody who's been through 6+ decades of drug addiction, not many people are still alive when they go through that. He is, and we weren't really sure if he would be here in physical form by the time we finished this movie and put it out in the world. But, you know, Vernon says this at the end of the movie, his music and the influence and impact his music has made and that he has made is so great that he lives whether he's here in physical form or not. It's like, you know, Sly has given us so much, right? We owe him more than he owes us.
What of Sly's many legacies do you think is the most important?
Wow, that's a great question. I think there's sort of intentional legacies and unintentional legacies. I think the intentional legacy is just his songcraft. And this idea that, you know, you can combine all these genres of music into one that is yours. I think that was a radical, revolutionary idea in '67 when the band, late '66 when the band formed, and through that first 5, 6, 7 years of his catalog. And I think it's even more poignant now because, like, you know, the best music is the stuff that's sort of like mixing and matching on the edges, you know what I mean? I love cross-genre stuff. Like, it's where a lot of the interesting things happen. And I think that's sort of a remainder of that early Sly and the Family Stone legacy. But I also think the unintentional thing that he's left us is this cautionary tale, right? On both sides of it, not just how to live your life and the ways that we cope with anxiety and guilt, but also, you know, to the viewing audience, the public spectacle that we like to make of certain artists and why. And that, you know, really the feeling and the message of the movie at the end of it is turning the mirror back on the audience and showing, like, we have to treat these artists who have given us so much with a lot of empathy and grace. And really, Amir's whole point in the big idea of this movie is, can we just be human? Can black artists just be human and not be seen as superhuman in order to just be? And, you know, can we make mistakes and have the space to sort of experiment and just let us be?
Yeah, and how is that possible when it's like just getting the art out there is like threading a needle, like every single time? Desert Island, you can only take one Sly song with you.
Oh, for me, it's Family Affair. And you know, it's such a bop. I really love that song. And you know, what's interesting, you know, the only version of Family Affair that's ever been released is this 3-minute quote unquote single edit. And so, you know, what we wanted to do for the soundtrack, we heard the original version, which is 4.5 minutes long. And it's got all this vamping at the end of the song, which is really great. And so on the soundtrack features a lot of sort of unreleased alternate versions of songs that have never been released before, including Amir did a remix of the original version of Family Affair, where he takes out the supplemental drums. It's just the Rhythm King drum machine, but it's the entire 4.5 minutes, including the vamps at the end. And then he layered these like keyboards and electric piano parts at the very, very end in such an Amir way. It's so great. And yeah, that'll be on the soundtrack.
For me, that is a mind-blowing piece of information.
Yeah, and it's funny because Sony was really great with us. They, even before we started like working on the film officially, they gave us access to all the reels in their archive, and they weren't really fully organized yet. So we were just sort of grabbing things at random and like pulling numbers off a spreadsheet and being like, "What's on that reel?" And they'd play it, and it was like, you know, we found Stand, you know, take one, which is just Sly at the piano, and it soundtracks the end of the movie, and then it'll also be on the soundtrack. And it's just Sly at a piano trying to figure out the melody. And then he does Stand Take Two, and it's a little bit more of him at the organ. We found Everyday People Take One, which is in the movie as a scene where you hear Sly directing the band to sort of like play it the way he hears it in his head. But at that time, it wasn't called Everyday People, it was called Some People. And you hear the engineer saying, Some People Take One. And you know, being able to sort of listen to these reels from like 67, 68, 69, 70, 71 of Sly and the band in the studio was just like a remarkable gift for us. And it was like, no one had heard those things since they were recorded. So when we found the Family Affair full version, I was like, why did they never put this out? You know, even on all the, you know, weird, obscure Sly and the Family Stone compilations that people have done officially and unofficially, never heard the full version, so.
You go through so much of Sly's catalog, and like so many of his songs are just him just like begging people just to accept him as he is, and just to accept like the music as it is. So it's so for that reason, it's surprising. It's not surprising to me because I'm sure the record labels wanted the bop. They wanted it shorter. They wanted it, you know, they wanted a single. As opposed to probably what he had, which is a little messier.
Yeah, it's a little messier at the end. And also, you know, some of Sly's later albums are really good.
I love Heard You Miss Me.
Yeah.
You know,
like
and High on You, I'm still putting a lot of those tracks on mixes that I'm making.
Yeah,
today.
it's like Small Talk is a great album.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's some songs on those later albums where you can tell Sly's trying to, you know, like Stephen Paley, his manager, says it's like a man or a woman trying to dye their hair. Yeah. He's doing versions of Higher and Family Affair, like versions of that on the later albums.
Yeah.
But like, there's all those albums have like one or two songs at least, 2 or 3 songs, which are just absolute.
Crossword Puzzle is great.
Yeah,
Sexy Situation
Puzzle,
is one of my favorite songs on the planet. And
Yeah.
it's like, you know, it's a little disco, it's a little boppy, but it's like, it's a great song.
And that's the thing about Hip Hop Kids, is Hip Hop Kids didn't know the chronology or the story. They were just like, is this good? Is this good? Is this good? Oh, this is good. Yeah, let's sample this. And I think that's what Vernon says at the end of the film too, where he's just like, you know, Hip Hop Kids aren't sort of concerned with his backstory. They're just looking, is this groove good?
Which is why that moment in the movie is so poignant, because it doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter to them.
It's sort of a way in which like the energy that Sly put into it and the intention that he put into his original music, in a lot of cases with like De La Soul or with Janet Jackson, it's the intention he put in comes through regardless of the context.
Yeah, that Janet Jackson scene is my favorite in the movie.
Me too.
It's really, really good.
The way they cut it together, where it's just like they're taking you through the creative process of how it came to be. Like that's my favorite shit.
Yeah, I mean it was Amir had this inspired idea to interview Jimmy and Terry separately, because usually they get interviewed together. And he's like, well, when Jimmy and Terry are together, Jimmy does all the talking, Terry doesn't say anything. So we interviewed them separately, 2 weeks apart, and Terry is very chatty, he's very talkative, and his insight in this film is great. And when we asked them about that story in particular, they both told it exactly the same, with the exact same details. So our editor, Josh Pearson, who is just an incredible genius. He plays that back and forth with each other of them telling the story. So it's a pretty good scene in the movie.
That's awesome.
Yeah.